Hello, I'm Christian Frasier. You're watching The Context on BBC News.
We are attacking all day, both to prepare the ground for the possibility of your entry, but also to continue striking Hezbollah. Today, Hezbollah expanded its range of fire, and later today, they will receive a very strong response. Prepare yourselves.
Well, there's just been more incoming Israeli fire, and there is smoke rising now. We can't tell exactly what has been hit, but that is a residential area with residential blocks.
We saw a lot of stranded people with their suitcase, with the small belongings that they could bring with them while escaping the southern Lebanon. They were just desperate to find a place.
We have heard again today just how dire the situation has become. The Security Council must deliver its responsibility for global peace and security.
Joining me on the panel tonight, Mikey Kay, former RAF assault helicopter pilot and military strategist, and Ivo Daalder, former US representative to NATO, now president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Lots to get through with Mikey and Ivo this evening, but first let me bring you the latest BBC news. The head of the Israeli Armed Forces, Herzi Halevi, has said preparations are being made for a possible ground invasion of Lebanon. Visiting his troops in northern Israel today, he said the Air Force will continue degrading Hezbollah to such a point that they can put boots on the ground. President Putin has reiterated that Russia reserves the right to use nuclear weapons if attacked by any state. He added that aggression by a non-nuclear state that was supported by a nuclear power would be considered a joint attack. The Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris is scheduled to deliver a speech in Pittsburgh laying out her plans for the economy if she is elected as president. She's speaking in the battleground state of Pennsylvania, where she's expected to announce new incentives to boost domestic manufacturing and to grow the middle class. And Earth is set to gain a tiny second moon this weekend. Scientists say a small asteroid is going to be captured by the Earth's gravitational pull until it breaks away late in November. It is just 10 metres long. It's named 2024 PT5. It is only observable, I should say, by professional telescopes. If you are just joining us, welcome to the programme. The great and the good, some of them not so good, are gathered in New York trying to piece together something, anything that could prevent all-out war in the Middle East. The Security Council will reconvene shortly to discuss the escalation in Israel and Lebanon. The United States and France have been working up a proposal today which might lead to some sort of truce in the north, though the Americans still believe the best route to that is a hostage deal with Hamas and a ceasefire in Gaza. So there are a lot of moving parts. The concern, widespread, is that Israel has for now given up on that peace process. The Defence Minister, Yoav Gallant, confirmed this morning the centre of gravity has shifted. They have called up 2 brigades of reserve soldiers. The head of the Israeli Armed Forces, Herzi Halevi, says preparations are now being made for a possible ground invasion.
We are not stopping. We will keep attacking and harming them everywhere. To do this, we are preparing to move. The sense is your military boots, your manoeuvre boots, will enter enemy territory. Your entry there, with force, will show them what it's like to meet a professional combat force.
Right now, the diplomacy is failing. The deep divisions between the United States and Russia, China increasingly independent, means the Security Council is paralysed to intervene on any issue, whether it's the Middle East, the war in Ukraine, or the dire situation in Sudan. And then there's the country not in the room, Iran. President Pezeshkian is in New York, simultaneously talking peace while urging Islamic countries to come to Hezbollah's defence. Tehran's main concern is preserving the proxies that they've built without getting dragged into a regional war themselves.
Israel has been defeated in Gaza, and no amount of barbaric violence can restore its myth of invincibility. Naturally, the blind state terrorism over the past few days in Lebanon, followed by massive aggression with thousands of victims, cannot go unanswered. The responsibility for all consequences will be borne by those who have thwarted all global efforts to end this horrific catastrophe and have the audacity to call themselves champions of human rights.
So, all eyes then turning in the next few hours to the Security Council. Let's bring in our colleague, Sumi Sumaskanda, who's in New York watching, but not with much hope, because the Security Council is pretty toothless. There's already a UN resolution in place, 1701, which is supposed to keep the two sides apart, Sumi, but no way to enforce it.
Indeed, that is the case, and that is why it is hard to think that there's that much optimism, Christian, to be honest, going into the Security Council meeting. But that being said, everyone we've spoken to today has said that they are absolutely adamant that there must be steps towards a de-escalation, towards an off-ramp in this escalation between Hezbollah and Israel. And interesting to note, we're here in New York, but we haven't been hearing from the Pentagon spokesperson, Sabrina Singh, speaking in the last few hours, and she said it doesn't appear from the Pentagon's perspective that a ground incursion into Lebanon from Israel is imminent. It's unclear, Christian, if that is perhaps messaging from the Pentagon, from Washington to Israel for what they want to see happen on the ground, namely a de-escalation. But certainly we spoke to the Swedish foreign minister earlier. We spoke to a number of people here on the ground who are deeply concerned about what we're witnessing on the ground in Lebanon at the moment. And I mentioned to you in the last hour, Christian, that the French and the U.S. have this plan that they are going to actually lay out at this UN Security Council meeting, from what we understand. Well, the French president spoke to our colleague from BBC Persian earlier, and I was just listening back to that, and he said, indeed, we have this roadmap, only time will tell. So that gives you a sense of perhaps the optimism and hope going into this meeting, but expectations are perhaps not that high. Now, we also spoke to the Finnish president, Alexander Stubb, about what he has seen from his conversations here on the ground as well, and this is what he told us.
It looks very difficult at the moment. So what we're seeing now is Israeli forces moving from Gaza, going towards Lebanon, and that to me is an indication of an escalation, and that's why I think all of us in the UN, and of course including the United States, need to try to contain Israel, not to continue this war anymore.
Do you think a diplomatic solution should tie the two fronts, what is happening in Gaza and the escalation with Hezbollah?
I think the diplomatic solution begins with a ceasefire, and that is linked to hostages. After that, we need a truce. After that, we need international peacekeeping. After that, we need a political process, and with international peacekeeping, after that, we need a political process, and with that political process, we need a two-state solution.
Assuming the Israeli Prime Minister is due in New York, I think he's due to leave tonight, although that is a fluid situation at the moment. He may delay until tomorrow, but the point being, since we're talking about this imminent ground invasion, is that he's in New York until Sunday. Do you think they are reserving a decision until he has heard what sort of plan the Americans are talking about?
That could well be, and I should say that we spoke to the Israeli ambassador to the UN yesterday and again today. We saw him this morning. We asked him if the Israeli Prime Minister indeed will be here in New York, and they said that is still up in the air. So clearly we're not going to get a final answer on that just yet as to whether Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will indeed deliver his address as planned here in New York. But one thing the Israeli ambassador did tell us is, looking ahead to the Security Council meeting here, they are very curious to hear what some of these plans are. He said that they've heard from the Americans. They are optimistic because they also want to see a diplomatic solution to this crisis, according to the Israeli ambassador. And he said what is very important for them to underline at the Security Council meeting is that they believe that Iran and Hezbollah are the aggressors here, and they want that to be taken into account in this meeting a little bit later. But interesting to hear from the Finnish president that they believe that allies working together can move something towards the finish line. As you said, Christian, it looks unlikely given what we're seeing on the ground in Lebanon. But certainly, if the Israeli Prime Minister is here on the ground, it could very well be that they are hoping that there is some movement if they can speak together with him. Of course, the Iranian president here is here as well, and Mahmoud Abbas is here as well from the Palestinian side. So there is optimism, there is hope, but we'll have to see what comes out of this Security Council meeting a little bit later.
Sumi, good stuff. Sumi is back with World News America at the top of the next hour. All her guests that she's spoken to today. Thank you very much indeed for that. Eva, let me pick up with you because a key part of all this is, of course, Iran's position. The proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, they are, if you want to think of it this way, they are Iran's forward defences. They're the buffer against Israel. They're getting battered. What do they do about it? Because that could very much define what happens next.
Well, what you're seeing is the bind, I think, that Tehran finds itself in. It has used these proxy forces, what it calls the axis of resistance, as sort of the forward deployment of its efforts to, in the first instance, deter Israel from attacking Iraq, and in the second instance, to undermine Israel's capacity to do so over time. And one of the hesitations we've seen from Tehran and indeed from Hezbollah up to this point has been this idea that the forces that Hezbollah still has need to be reserved for that deterrence of a direct attack by Israel on Iran. Israel, however, has a different calculation. It woke up on October 7th with this massive, extraordinary terrorist attack, the worst day of violence against the Jewish states and against Jews since the Holocaust, and calculated from that moment on, we can never be again in a situation where we're this vulnerable. The focus was Hamas and Gaza for a very long time. We can talk about how effective that was, but that was the focus. Now the focus is on Hezbollah and to remove that threat to Israel, not just to the northern border, to Israel proper. The problem is, as long as Iran is around, and as long as Iran is supporting Hezbollah and all the other states, actually removing that security threat militarily, in the end, can only be done if you are also willing to go to war against Iran. And that's not what anybody wants, including in Israel.
Mike, a lot of people have questioned why Israel escalated so quickly. First, we had the exploding pages, then this immense bombardment on Monday. I mean, I think someone who was involved in targeting will explain to me what you think is going on here. But equally, it does look as if they're trying to bait Hezbollah into an attack that would allow them once and for all to take the fight to what it considers to be the real enemy, and that is Iran.
Well, there's a couple of things that are big questions in my head at the moment, Christian. The first one is the intelligence that the IDF seem to have on Hezbollah seems to be pretty solid in terms of the preemptive strikes that the IDF made on Hezbollah. Just answering your question on the build-up started way before the pagers and this recent artillery strikes. It's been going on for months, ever since the beginning of the year. You've had IDF strikes on the Iranian embassy in Damascus. You've had IDF strikes on key Hezbollah targets inside Syria. You've had IDF strikes on targets inside Beirut. So there's been a gradual build-up since January of this year, and this is sort of the culmination of it all, if you like. But going back to my original point, you have Israel that preemptively struck Hezbollah in the last month, yet at the same time, the intelligence seemed to let them down on October the 7th, 2023, without a preemptive strike on what arguably was, the worst strike on Israel since the Holocaust. So one of the big questions I've got at the moment is where is the weak spot inside IDF intelligence? Why wasn't that preemptive strike occurred on October the 7th last year to prevent what occurred? And why are we seeing such preemptive strikes and such sort of forward thinking from the IDF on taking out Hezbollah?
Do you think, Eva, that in some ways undermines the confidence? I mean, I was reporting in Lebanon in 2006, and people have short memories if they think this is going to be easy. The Israelis got in, and it got really sticky, and then they pulled out some months later. Do you think that actually that gap in intelligence is what might just be playing on the commanders' minds at the moment in Israel?
Well, I certainly hope so, because if there is no doubt that their intelligence is perfect, we saw on October 7, 2023, that it isn't. and that intelligence is a difficult business. It's putting together different strands of information in order to come to a conclusion, and to on information that is never complete and total. And yet, it seems that after 2006, the Lebanon war that ended in a stalemate, really, actually, in an Israeli shellacking, a defeat in serious ways, that both Hezbollah and Israel learned a lot of lessons. Hezbollah learned that what it needed was to have strategic capabilities so that it could threaten Israel wherever it wanted to, and it has about 150 to 200,000 rockets and missiles, including long-range missiles with precision guidance. One of which was shot at Tel Aviv just the other day. And the Israelis have decided that they needed enough intelligence to preempt them. And I fear that there may be this optimism that because the pager attack was so seemingly successful, that the kind of strikes we've seen from the air in the last few days again seem to have degraded Hezbollah's capabilities quite significantly. And the number of strikes, 1,600 strikes on Monday, is about 8 times what it was during the height of the 2006 war. And yet this confidence in technical capabilities and intelligence misses perhaps the point that ultimately war objectives is about territory and about politics. And that's beyond just technology and intelligence. And I worry of overconfidence on the Israeli side that they have achieved something that may be tactically successful, but not strategically.
It's really interesting. Just before we finish, can we focus for a second on that missile that Hezbollah fired at Tel Aviv this morning? First time they've done that, the target was Mossad HQ. You'll see in this video a white plume of smoke in the air, which is the moment the missile was intercepted by the Iron Dome system. And soon after that, the IDF struck the location from which it had been fired. So that is the intelligence that Mikey's talking about. The BBC verified team have geolocated that position. It's about 136 kilometres, 84 miles from Tel Aviv. What does that tell you, Mikey, about the capability Hezbollah has and Israel's ability to defeat it?
It's significant. Hezbollah are battle hardened at the moment. They've been in combat inside Syria for the past decade. They've obviously taken attrition from that. But at the same time, the logistics resupply of weaponry to Hezbollah, to Assad's forces from Iran, is now a well-oiled machine. And so these significant armaments that you're seeing inside southern Lebanon, the Israeli forces today use the whole graphic setup of LiDAR and how they're targeting cruise missiles. That's a well-oiled machine. And so there is significant armament now coming through Syria because of the relationships that Hezbollah have evolved with Syria over the last 10 years. And so, that's an important factor. I think the other thing I sort of think is really important here as well is what distinguishes Hezbollah's situation from the Gaza situation is I've been to Melita, I've been down into southern Lebanon, I've walked through the tunnels that Hezbollah has. And it doesn't take a quick glance to go back in history where if you look at Vietnam, more bombs were dropped from the air by the US on Vietnam than the entirety of World War II. If you look at the US Army, which has an $830 billion defense budget, with massive air power, it failed with a massive occupation inside Afghanistan. And so, in military parlance and military strategy, there's always this conversation about, whilst air power and air superiority might be significant, can it actually win the war on the ground? And if you do put boots on the ground, and Israel will have to put boots on the ground in order to weed out who they regard as the enemy, which is Hezbollah, that necessarily won't lead to what people will call a success. So I think before all of this starts, Israel or Netanyahu and the IDF have to define in their own strategy, what does success look like? What does win mean? What is the definition of that?
That strategy, as many commentators have said, just isn't there. The technical know-how is there, but the end game, the strategy, most certainly is not defined. It's really interesting listening to you both, actually, because obviously there are big risk assessment conversations going on in Washington and in the White House right now at the moment as to how this turns into a regional war. And I think you've both very eloquently defined how we might get there. There's a lot of risk at the moment. Let's take a short break. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. Welcome back. Earlier this year, an American Airlines pilot who was flying above Pakistan received an alarm signal in his cockpit telling him to pull up. In fact, he was cruising at 32,000 feet, far above any terrain or any dangers. The signal he'd received was bogus, known as GPS spoofing. These fake signals that militaries will typically use to confuse incoming drones and missiles are becoming more frequent. The industry says they, in fact, have gone well beyond the active conflict zones that we're looking at here. We found an AI program that's compiling a map of these spoofing incidents. You'll see a lot of these spots are over the Middle East and Ukraine, over the Balkans, Belarus, where they are used for military purposes. But those dots now starting to spread across the map. In fact, the civil aviation authorities have started looking at these incidents. They say they've increased to more than 1,000 in August. Joining me is Ross Sagan. He's a former commercial airline pilot. Ross, good to have you with us. You ever come across this when you were flying?
I've come across similar circumstances, such as the American pilots, where the GPS had a failure and affected the ground proximity warning system. But in my case, I believe it was more environmental than intentional.
Why do you think it's accelerating and becoming more common?
Well, I think it's a great strategy for those that would like to confuse aircraft penetrating their airspace, for example, in the conflicted areas of the Middle East and Eastern Europe.
I'm reading some of the incidents that the Wall Street Journal collected. You've got a spoof signal that sent a private jet into Iran without clearance. The crew of an Airbus A320 that left Cyprus in July, suddenly reporting a severe map shift. A Boeing 787 aborted 2 landings, one of them 50 feet above the ground after losing GPS. I mean, if you were coming into land with reduced visibility and suddenly you lose GPS, that's quite serious, isn't it?
It is. It's a very serious, however, but it's currently very limited in scope and something that people have to be very aware of. And it could have potentially fatal consequences. Of course, if you lose navigational performance, especially close to the ground, this can be very serious. Also, we have to keep in mind that the GPS drives the ground proximity warning system as well. So if those signals are compromised, separation from objects on the ground can be compromised as well.
Mikey, give us the military aspect to this. Give us a better idea of what it's actually used for, GPS spoofing. Sorry, let me just bring in Mikey, who's sitting here in the studio with us. Go
on. I think if you go sort of traditionally the way it's been used in Afghanistan and Iraq, especially over the counterinsurgencies, is if you've got a convoy, for example, going from Kabul to Kandahar, the Taliban will have laid lots of IEDs in order to try and compromise that convoy. Those IEDs would be triggered by what's called an RF signal, a radio frequency signal. And so the convoys would carry jamming pods on them, which would effectively interrupt any RF signal that would allow someone from the Taliban to trigger mechanism the IED when the convoy got close. So it effectively produced a bubble around the convoy. That's called a jamming pod.
So if you were flying through a military corridor, you would perhaps pick up one of those. It wouldn't be unusual for a commercial airline to pick that up unintentionally.
The bubbles that we're talking about probably go up to a couple of 100 feet. Right. So, you know, like with any signal, military airliners that are transiting usually fly over 30,000 feet if they're on long-haul flights. So it's interesting, you know, I'd like more information on this in terms of where those episodes are occurring. So if they're on, you know, as the gentleman previously on suggested, if they're on approach on an ILS or a GPS approach, and they're in inclement weather as you alluded to, then yeah, that's a significant issue.
Eva, why do you think it's spreading? Have you ever come across this in your capacity?
Well, we know that the Russians are doing GPS jamming and spoofing of various kinds. If you talk to pilots, commercial pilots, flying in the Baltics or into Finland, they are complaining about a quite regular occurrence in which their GPS signal either disappears or malfunctions, and they've gotten quite used to this. And I do think that we are seeing Russian intelligence and Russian military intervention in increasingly beyond the immediate battle zone in Ukraine. One of the ways that the Russians have been starting to retaliate in their mind to Western support for Ukraine is to engage in this kind of hybrid warfare that is designed to make it more difficult and to disrupt even the civilian and economic lifeline that is in Europe and indeed even in the United States. So that is certainly one of the things we're increasingly worried about.
OK, we will keep our eye on that story. Ross, it's really good of you to join us this evening. Thank you very much for your thoughts. I should just reassure you that pilots are trained on how to use and how to fly without GPS navigation systems, so they're not entirely flying blind. But it is interesting that it's something that has grown quite rapidly over the last year. We're going to take a short break. The other side of the break, we've got lots going on regarding Ukraine. I've just been watching President Zelensky, who is in President Biden's company. We're going to talk about what he wants, the presentation of that victory plan tomorrow, and the role the Chinese are playing, which is significant. Stay with us.
Hello. As we head towards the end of September, it has been a pretty wet month for many, especially across central and southern parts of the UK. We've had more rain around on Wednesday, and over the next few days it's still looking pretty wet. There'll be some strong winds as well, perhaps something a little bit drier and quieter by the time we get to the weekend. But for the here and now, this is the rainfall we're likely to see accumulate between now and the end of Friday. Could be as much as 80 millimetres, perhaps parts of northeast England, potentially through the Midlands into Wales as well. So areas that could really do without seeing more rainfall as it falls on that saturated ground. So low pressure is driving our weather. It's gradually shifting its way eastwards at the moment. We've got some rainfall the rest of this evening and tonight, pushing across central and eastern parts of England. Northern England, it's going to be pretty persistent overnight. Northern Ireland also seeing some outbreaks of rain. To the south of that, clear interludes and intermittent heavy showers, perhaps some thunderstorms rattling through overnight as well. It's northern and central parts of Scotland that are going to stay driest for longest, but temperatures falling into single figures here. Most of us, though, sticking in double figures overnight. But through the day on Thursday, that rain is going to be quite persistent for parts of northeast England, driven in with that brisk easterly wind. Northern Ireland also looking pretty wet for a good part of the day. Further south across England and Wales, sunshine and showers, but the showers could be torrential at times, bringing a threat of localised flooding, some hail in the mix, some lightning as well. 18 degrees in the sunshine in between the showers. Cooler but drier for the north of Scotland. That cooler air then sinks a little bit further south across the UK as we move through into Friday. So a bit of a change in wind direction. Still some heavy rain for many central and southeastern parts to start the day on Friday. Looks like that clears away, and then we're back into clearer, fresher conditions with sunshine and a few blustery showers as well. Temperatures ranging between only about 9 or 10 in the north to 13 or 14 towards the south. So certainly a colder feeling day Friday. Fast forward into Saturday, first thing could look like this. Some frosty conditions, 2 or 3 degrees in some of our towns and cities. Could be a little bit colder than that in the more rural spots. So heading through the course of the weekend, then a lot of dry and settled weather on the cards. We've got this area of high pressure dominating our weather, although it will feel colder. A front brings a few showers across the north of Scotland, and then later on Sunday, the next area of rain moves in from the southwest. But it won't be as wet as it has been across central and southern parts of England. Perhaps a bit more rain in the north and the west on Sunday. Bye-bye.
Ukraine is just about holding the front here while the Russians have launched this fresh assault.
Everywhere you look, there are uprooted trees, there are bits of building, and the destruction is just in every direction.
Incendiary drones were dropped here. We know this was the military junta because the rebels don't have that kind of weaponry.
When you can hear the tear gas canisters being lobbed at the protesters.
There when the story breaks. BBC News. Follow on the app.
Morning. Come and have a seat. Now, of course, I'm not going to go easy on you. There are some really big questions we've got to try and get answers to this morning. But I'll be fair, and we just want to hear what you've got to say. So, shall we get on with it?
We're rolling.
Here we go. Join me to hear from the biggest names inside and outside politics.
Sunday with Laura Koonsberg. Watch on BBC iPlayer.
You get scared?
No, I don't get scared. I've covered many wars over many years.
It bothers me to think about North Korean surveillance. Anything left on a shred of paper or my laptop, could it put somebody else's life at risk?
It was always going to be a history-making election.
This is not the time to stumble over my words. My job is to expose how people are targeted because I'm a reporter who can do that.
Behind the stories. Watch on BBC iPlayer.
Hello, I'm Christian Frasier. You're watching The Context on BBC News. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has warned the United Nations delegates that Russia is preparing a serious escalation of its war against his country. And that is where we're going to start, because the victory plan that President Zelensky will present to the White House tomorrow has been kept largely under wraps until Joe Biden has seen it. But some elements of the plan have been briefed, including the need for more timely decisions from Western allies. The US president still lingering on his decision as to whether the longer range attack missiles can be used on targets inside Russia. Today at the General Assembly in New York, Zelensky was exhorting the international community not to forget Ukraine amid everything else that is going on, or the dangers of a nuclear disaster that Russia still poses to his country.
Now Putin does seem to be planning attacks on our nuclear power plants and their infrastructure, aiming to disconnect the plants from the power grid. Any missile or drone strike, any critical incident in the energy system could lead to a nuclear disaster. A day like that must never come. And Moscow needs to understand this, and this depends in part on your determination to put pressure on the aggressor. These are nuclear power plants. They must be safe.
Well, the military element of the plan he's put together deals with what Ukraine thinks it needs in the short term to keep the pressure on Russia, more on air defence and a demand for future NATO membership as well. Zelensky has support from the Europeans on the missiles. British officials have argued that Ukraine cannot be expected to fight effectively unless it can attack military sites beyond the border that Russia is using. But we've had some more sabre rattling tonight from the Russian president. In a meeting of his Security Council, he said Russia reserves the right to use nuclear weapons if it is attacked by any state supported by a nuclear power.
Any aggression against Russia with the participation or support of the nuclear weapon state will be regarded as a joint attack on the Russian Federation. We have been very clear. We would be on a nuclear footing as soon as we receive reliable information of any massive aerial attack and the crossing of our state border by strategic or tactical aircraft, cruise missiles, drones or hypersonic missiles.
We'll talk in a second whether he's sabre-rattling or not, whether he means it. But Keir Starmer said just in the last hour that Britain will continue to stand by Ukraine. I think they're more disposed to the Ukrainians using these longer range missiles, but why do we need the American permission for them to use the Storm Shadow that we've supplied?
America is the biggest donator and biggest influencer inside NATO. And I think historically, NATO has never done anything outside or unilaterally outside of, permission from the US. So I don't think that's a surprise. I don't think what Putin is talking about now in terms of his motivation to use nuclear weapons is either a surprise, because Putin knows that there's a conversation going on right now about whether longer range missiles that have been supplied by the West to Ukraine can be used inside Russia. The bit that's complicating that in terms of what Joe Biden's conversation will be is if Joe Biden says no, then you've already got Ukrainian forces inside Russia. They've invaded Kursk. They're occupying Kursk at the moment. And so should there be a tactical requirement to use those missiles to defend Ukrainian positions inside Russia, and Joe Biden has said no, that's going to leave the Ukrainians exposed. So there's pressure on Joe Biden at the moment to make that decision. But is that decision inside a certain geographic area of where Ukrainian forces are?
Well, I was going to ask you that. Do you think that there will be a sort of list of acceptable targets the Americans would allow the Ukrainians to use?
I think it will come down to rules of engagement. And I think it will come down to rules of engagement basically are the use of proportionate and graduated force up to and including the use of lethal, depending on the threat. So if Ukraine forces are reporting an imminent threat, whether that be within the next hour, whether that be in the next 48 hours because Russian forces are posturing, then that should be the conversation on whether a long-range strike from inside Ukraine can go inside Russian territory.
Okay. Eva, I want to talk to you about sanctions, but I just want to really explain a bit of this to our audience, because the Ukrainians have presented evidence in Brussels yesterday, in fact, that nearly 2/3 of foreign-made components in Russian weapons are being produced or re-exported from China. 60%, in fact, of the foreign-made microchips, circuit boards, critical components for drones and missiles manufactured or resold by Chinese firms. Here's what the Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen said in New York yesterday. "I don't think it would be possible," she said, "for Russia to have a full-scale war for more than 2.5 years without China's help. We need to be less dependent on China. Europe always tries to play by the rules, but when you find out someone else is not doing it, then you have to be able to react." Now, the Secretary of State, Eva, has already talked about this. Reuters are reporting tonight that actually they've had intelligence from a European intelligence agency that they are now making an entire weapon system, a drone in China, via a Russian company based in China, which will be used in Ukraine. Does that cross another red line for the State Department?
Well, it crosses a line for sure. So first of all, there is no doubt that China has allowed, through the export of dual-use technologies to Russia, to enable the Russian defense industry to survive. And I think Prime Minister Frederiksen is absolutely right that the Russians couldn't have done what they are doing without that support. But this report in Reuters that there are actual weapon systems being built, a sophisticated long-range drone system in China for use and export and then use in the war against Ukraine is a qualitatively different set of steps. And it does really point to the need for the West to start thinking very seriously about not just the threat that Russia represents, which we see every single day in Ukraine, but the reality that Russia could not represent that threat without China. And that means that the way we have to deal with China has to be very different than the kind of way we have in the past, which is to believe that it is a big market and therefore we should be selling everything we can. The U.S. has already announced that it will impose secondary financial sanctions, so basically telling companies that are found to be violating the sanctions with regard to Russia would be excluded from the U.S. financial system. This needs to be far more concerted and far heavier because, again, Prime Minister Frederiksen is absolutely right. This war would not go as far as it has gone without the active support of
But
China.
I mean, if I was to refer to Ed Conway, a colleague at Sky, who's just been out to the border with Georgia, I was reading a thread that he put on X today. These sanctions, they're not very tight, are they? We've got British cars going over the border from Georgia. There are components in trucks going over for manufacturing. It's Europe and the United States that are not doing enough to impose the sanctions that are already in place.
Well, that's true, and this is the problem of having a large international economy in which country A may be selling material to country B that will then send it to country C and ultimately ended up to the sanctioned country, country D. And that's what's happening in Georgia. It's what's happening in Kazakhstan, and all of these facilities need to be tracked in a much more vigorous way than they have so far. But nevertheless, even what you see going across the border in Georgia or Kazakhstan, for that matter, pales in comparison to the kind of support that the Chinese have been providing to the Russians. And that is where the real problem resides. And that's where the focus of our efforts needs to be.
In terms of what is at stake at the moment in the US election, there's nothing quite as stark, I don't think, as the issue of Ukraine. If Trump wins, I think we can all safely say that the Ukrainians are on their own. And judging by Trump's comments in Georgia last night, he seems quite happy for Russia to win.
I watched him. We will win. We will. He's been saying that for 3 years. Every time Zelensky comes to the United States, he walks away with $100 billion. I think he's the greatest salesman on earth. But we're stuck in that war unless I'm president. I'll get it done. I'll get it negotiated. I'll get out. We got to get out. Biden says, we will not leave until we win. What happens if they win? That's what they do, is they fight wars. As somebody told me the other day, they beat Hitler, they beat Napoleon. That's what they do. They fight. And it's not pleasant.
We had his former national security advisor, H.R. McMaster, on the programme last week. He was saying to me again he could never quite work out the hold that President Putin had on Donald Trump. We'll maybe talk with Eva about that in a second. But just in terms of, there's a whole debate here in Europe about defence procurement and whether the Europeans could stand behind Ukraine if Donald Trump wins. You're grimacing. You don't think they could?
You know, the US is the biggest contributor in terms of finance to NATO. I think European forces from the UK to France to Germany are all, especially Macron, he's leading the way now in terms of figuring out how Europe stands alone in terms of defense. Because, you know, we're talking about Zelensky being in the US, we're talking about the plan that Joe Biden's going to sign, but all that could be thrown in the bin in 6 weeks' time. So, you know, these questions are big and important. You know, when it comes to Putin and Georgia, he invaded Georgia in 2008, 15 years ago, and annexed 20% of Georgia. He did the same in 2014 in Crimea. You know, there's a playbook going on here, and I refer anyone watching tonight to John Sweeney's brilliant book, Killer in the Kremlin, which beautifully articulates, after 30 years of investigative journalism, Putin's rise to power. So, you know, there is absolutely nothing that the US or any aspect of the US should be supporting in what Putin is doing, because there is significant evidence over decades of what Putin is trying to achieve. As to the compromat that Putin has on Trump, read John Sweeney's book, because he goes into in depth, and you know, I probably not for comment on air.
Ivo, it's such a defeatist message. I mean, it says America's ready to roll over for autocrats. It's weak. There are questions already about American leadership in the Middle East and on Ukraine. And if we are at an inflection point, I wonder what you make of a possible future Trump presidency.
Well, just in the comment with regard to Ukraine and Russia that you just played from Donald Trump, I mean, just two realities. One is he will not be able to end the war because neither side wants to end the war, and I think Ukrainians will fight with forks and knives if that takes it, because it's their country they're trying to defend. And this idea that somehow I will cut off aid you accept the territorial compromise and peace is at hand, that's a chimera. It's not going to happen. It's not what the Ukrainians will accept. And number two, this idea that Russia is 10 feet tall, that therefore the United States should just walk away and say, oh my God, they win wars. For one, they didn't win World War II without our help. Of course, we didn't win World War II without their help. But more importantly, they haven't won a war against Japan. They didn't win a war against Crimea. They didn't want to win a war in Afghanistan. They didn't win the first war against Chechnya. This is not a country that is 5 feet tall. Indeed, it is 4 times larger than Ukraine, and it has achieved strategic disaster at the cost of 600 to 1,000 people wounded and killed, and very, very little gain. So this idea that somehow Russia is so incredibly strong that we, the United States, we, the West, need to just abide our time and let him go, just shows a kind of geopolitical immaturity, frankly, that I don't think the United States or, frankly, the world can afford.
We'll leave that there. We're going to take a short break. Around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News. Now it's time for the panel. We'll start with Ivo, because Ivo, you've read a book recently on civil disorder in the United States. Tell us about it.
It's a fantastic book by Eric Larson, who's a narrative historian, called The Demon of Unrest, a saga of hubris, heartbreak, and heroism at the dawn of the Civil War. It's a description of what happened to the United States and in the United States when President Lincoln was surprisingly elected in 1860, and the day that the Civil War started. It's those 3 or 4 months in between that in which the country fell apart. And it has eerie echoes, as indeed Eric Larson said. He really started focusing on writing this book in the immediate aftermath of January 6th. And this election and the depolarization and indeed the dangers that the illiberalism of President Trump and others represent is a warning sign. Read this book to see what can happen to a country that is deeply divided.
Do you have concerns about what might happen after November 5th?
I do. I have serious concerns that the President Trump has made very, very clear that no matter what the outcome of the election, if he doesn't win, it's because it's stolen. And they have spent the last 4 years developing a playbook to challenge these elections. This is a playbook that emphasizes making sure that victory is secure no matter how the vote actually comes out. That's what we saw in an amateurish way in 2021. I think we're going to see it far worse and more sophisticated at this time around.
That is a sobering thought, is it not? Mikey, you want to talk about this. The security brief. This is a new series that we're going to do together.
I've been waiting for this moment for a couple of months, actually, Christian. Yeah, no, I'm delighted to be invited by you onto your show once a week to talk about deep dives into a lot of the conversations we've been having tonight. As we've seen, you know, covering the panel, it's been an hour. We could have taken the whole 2 hours of the show to talk about Hezbollah or Gaza or Russia, Ukraine. And so I'm delighted to be able to come in and use my 30 years of counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, 20 of those in the military, many combat tours in Iraq, Afghanistan, Kosovo, Northern Ireland, evacuation operations out of West Africa, and give some insider information, knowledge and expertise using very close contacts who I'm still in contact with inside military circles to be able to just break it down a little bit more using visuals, using maps, using graphics, using, you know, pictures of bombs, aircraft that are launched off, weapon systems, battle damage assessments, collateral damage assessments, just to be able to give your viewers a little bit more of an insight.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily, is it, about glorifying war or the missiles and the kit that armed forces use. It's, as we were talking tonight, and as Ivo was clearly setting out as well, you know, when you consider, you know, the sort of capability that Hezbollah has, we need to understand that in the context of the political decisions that are being taken. It's not just wander into South Lebanon and get rid of a few fighters in the south of the country. There's a whole system there that we need to properly understand. We need to understand the capability that they have.
Yeah, and you know, there's so much misinformation and disinformation out there at the moment. And I have the privilege of having been on the inside and being exposed to a lot of the mechanisms of the way that war is prosecuted, all the way from on the ground to United Nations military observers courses, giving me a deep insight into the way the UN works. We talked about paralysis of the P5. And so it's about giving people the information so they can make their own decisions on, you know, what is ethically and morally correct, and, you know, what should be supported by governments or what should be pushed back against by governments as they come up with their own policy.
I'm looking forward to that. It's coming soon. We've got to trial it first. We're going to go away and play with it.
You didn't say we had a trial. You said we're going straight live to air.
I would never do that. I wouldn't subject our viewers to that. Ivo, it's been lovely having your company this evening. I hope you'll come back soon. Thank you very much for that. Mikey, good to see you as ever. We will be back same time tomorrow. It's Hey I Decoded tomorrow. You know how much I love that. So do join us for that. We'll be back tomorrow. See you then.
Hello, I'm Sarah Mulcairns at the BBC Sports Centre. Let's start then with the Europa League, where Manchester United have just had an underwhelming start to their competition against the Dutch side FC 20.